just over a year ago with BBC Micro, and we partially with that success. We're hoping for a further success this afternoon in a similar way. So I'm going to hand you over to their chairman for the day, let him introduce the other speakers, and that is George Auckland, and he's going to introduce the project, and he is, what was, Head of Learning at the BBC?
Head of Learning
Learning Innovation. Yeah, so, we all need that, don't we? So George, the meeting is yours. Oh, you have?
Is that working?
Yep.
Yeah, I've a fairly kind of wacky job title. It's Head of Learning, it's Head of Innovation for BBC Learning. And that means I have come to inherit a certain number of things, because the first thing I've got to say is from the Domesday Project, just as much as from, I said the same thing last year with BBC Micro, I am the fraud in the room. I didn't work on the Domesday Project, I was around in the department, but I kind of inherited it in terms of the BBC. The real people who work will be speaking later. And the other thing I want to say, which I would apologise, but I'm not going to, is you've probably heard the phrase death by PowerPoint. Well, you'll be probably even more pleased to hear my PowerPoint has died. And I think we haven't even got time for a resurrection, let alone a resurrection ceremony. So I noticed earlier this was a blue screen, and I spend a lot of my time in television studios with blue screen, you know that's bad. So you're going to have to imagine what my pictures are like, but it will have the biggest advantage, which is that I will be shorter than I plan to be, and I plan to be quite short anyway, because the meat of the meeting is undoubtedly later, and in fact very soon. But fortunately, I did bring a few artifacts along, which I thought would amuse you and you could look at. That's a Domesday book. This is an English translation for Berkshire, so there's obviously one for each county. I just happen to have one of these. Have a look later, it's quite fun to look up people's names. And I also brought along, if we get a chance later on, and possibly not, a BBC programme that we made a DVD copy this morning, which is about the Domesday Project. And I'm told that the first 2 or 3 minutes show, you know, the original equipment all working. So we might have a look at that later if we can get to work. So just a bit of background as to how it sort of came my way. I was minding my own business at work, and I got this email from a chap, and it said, "Dear George, you don't know me, but I was one of those children who took some photographs which are in the Domesday Project." Now I knew quite a lot about it because it was part of what was a BBC Education or spin-off from BBC Education. And I'm now a very senior person in computing, and I'd like to find out how we might unlock it. This is before I've met any of these guys. And I wrote back to him and said, "Dear Simon, great idea, I haven't got any money." And he wrote back and said, "Dear George, don't worry, I don't want any." And so we made him sign a non-disclosure agreement, which is a real kind of trick at the BBC, and took him down to the written archives in Caversham, where there is a whole room full, I think Andy will know this, of all the documentation that went with the Domesday Project. It must be one of the best paper documented projects I've ever come across. Absolutely amazing, including every one of the little contracts or blood sheets, as we call them, that signed off all the photographs. Now, having been a TV producer, I started doing BBC Online, and it's my view in terms of legacy, which is what I was asked to sort of touch on. So we're doing this afternoon inside out. I'm going to talk about the legacy first, and then we'll talk about the real thing later. There's no doubt in my mind, coming out of the BBC Micro and then Domesday, you know, that the whole of education was fired up with this whole idea of interactivity, and I can talk for England about the role of interactivity within education. So at the early part of the 90s, shortly after the web popped up, BBC Education, or a spin-off from it, started what was then the BBC Networking Club, some of you may remember it, which was a sort of friendly face of Auntie to get people into online. And I did several television programmes around that area. We learned a bit of HTML, made some very early websites, and I would maintain all the way through that those are BBC Online is one of the legacies, without any doubt, of all that work that was done in the 80s by Peter Handy and so forth. And I think that's a fantastic legacy to have. Now I'm hoping still within my role at the BBC, and I mean I'm now even technically past retirement age, but still there, that we may increase that legacy. And the area I'm especially interested in is what's now called user-generated content. In other words, the photographs the kids took. There are 25,000 or 24,000 and something like 50,000 articles in there, all of which have been extracted in various forms. We've got some extractions, and Andy's done some fantastic work, and David talked about that later. And we did a little, which I was going to show you on the PowerPoint, so you imagine it. In 2004, we just did a little brainstorm about what would it do to drag the Domesday Project into the 21st century. And of course, what found out to be is you want a mobile version, something that will work on mobile phones. So we did this little pilot, which I can't demonstrate now. The idea being, you took your mobile phone, slightly futuristic phone out, you got located where you were, either in a phone cell or increasingly by GPS, contacted the BBC, and the BBC sent you 2 or 3 of the photographs from the Domesday Project from approximately where you were, and then the fun started, because that was only approximately, because my recollection is that the photographs in terms of location were within a 3 kilometre by 4 kilometre rectangle, of which we only have the bottom left-hand corner coordinates for those photographs. So I thought, well, there's a problem, let's turn it into advantage, make it fun, it's like a quest. There are the photos. So just suppose you could find the photo, you could re-photograph it from approximately the same angle, send it back to us, and we have a nice little then and now type thing. I'm sure you can imagine all that. You can see the pictures happening. I have some beautiful ones where we've gone and done this, found some of the locations, re-photographed them, and then in PowerPoint mixed them together so you can see the general idea, so you get that gist of it. Now, as a number of people have spotted, the content itself has got all sorts of copyright issues. There are professional photography in there, articles, obviously all the maps and so forth, and clearly the individual photographs have some kind of copyright. And I spoke to BBC lawyers about this, and just talking only about the user-generated, i.e. the photographs that the children and various other people took in 1986, 85, 86. So a nice age has gone by. You know, those children who took those photographs at 13 or 14 could now have children the same age they were. There's an interesting little resonance there. And also, which I think is as important, those people who took those photographs, because inevitably the apparatus was very expensive, hardly any of them ever got to see them. So in a lot of people's minds, there's a lot of unfinished business. I think 10,000 schools were involved in this. 14. There are 30,000 schools in the United Kingdom. That's a pretty impressive, there's a whole team, run by Peter, sorting all this stuff out. Hence, I think, this mountain of paperwork. So the BBC lawyers tried to be as helpful as possible, but there is a problem that the paperwork signed off doesn't relate to the pictures. There's no way to blend the two together. It's just a mountain of paperwork, as far as I can tell, and I've seen this stuff. So the only light at the end of the tunnel was that one of the more friendly of the lawyers says, I know you won't want to be told that, that's the view. But if you can find a very, very senior BBC manager who will say formally, I think this is a low risk, then you're probably okay to go ahead and release these pictures. And certainly when I've discussed it with National Archives, they keep saying, for heaven's sake, George, just do it, people would love it, and so forth. So that's kind of where we are now, that is a possibility. Now, within BBC Learning, as part of our innovation work, we've recently launched a thing which is called BBC Learning Open Lab. And this is the first time that we've tried to create something that deals with the whole concept of open source. Open source as code, open source as content, open hardware, I understand, is an interesting area that's developing. So what we're trying to do within this open lab is link together primary and secondary school teachers who are not well aware of open source with people in the open source community and see if we can get a dialogue going. It's an experiment. But we also want to release content wherever it's realistic to allow people to do, in this horrible modern phrase, a mashup. You've probably heard people, I used to be a film editor, so I hate my old profession. People know what we're doing, I'm just doing a mashup with this video. But anyway, so that's kind of where we are now. So what I'm obviously hoping is that as this meeting progresses and we have other discussions, that we might be able to look at how we've now got a vehicle through which we could release this, we think, in a reasonably organised fashion, and we have access to the content. We've got some versions that have got pictures that say where it is. We've got others, you know, we've got 2 sets of 24,000 images, all of which are the same except for one thing. Is there any software that will match the two together and all this kind of stuff? So we can identify the photos. Can we say what is the latitude and longitude within reason of every photo? Because if you can do that, then you do have some interesting possibilities of people, teachers and other people finding uses for this material. And one hopes adding new stuff to it. So in the event of no PowerPoint, I think I shall stop at that, and then you can now hear the history of it. Peter Armstrong, who was the executive on the project, I mean, it was essentially your project, wasn't it, Peter? Was it your idea to begin with? It was going to give you some background, and then Andy will talk, and then at the end David will talk about the resurrection. So, Peter.
Connection with the BCS is very tenuous, but you very kindly gave us an award back in '86 for the Domesday Project, and I remember that being a very nice occasion. This seems a very nice one too, so very good to be here. Good dinner, was it? Yes, very good. That's right, it was, yes. So I'm here to give you a bit of the backstory, as you've heard, about Domesday, and also some of the modern resonances. And thinking about the modern resonances, I was reading the papers I came in on the train, and what does Victor Keegan say this morning? But I step out of my front door and geograph.org.uk will show me photos of my street. It has now mapped more than 90% of the UK with pictures of every square kilometre. Sites such as quipe.co.uk, spoonfed.co.uk and numerous other sites, including Google, tell us where the nearest shops, bars, dentists and restaurants are, which is pretty much a description of what we were trying to do, and people are still doing. So that was comforting in a way, but also the fact that it's still only got to 90%. So when we started, it was a bit of it started as a light-hearted idea, a rather crazy idea, but then by the time we were 2 years in, I made a note in my diary, and I was just looking back at it, and this is what it said. It's probably true to say that if we'd known at the beginning what we know now about the difficulties involved, we'd never have attempted the Domesday Project. As I write, we are 10 weeks away from an unmovable deadline, because of the anniversary obviously. We're still up to our necks in computer code, test disks that sometimes mysteriously fail, reports from university mainframes running round-the-clock checks, and the suspicion that we've reported the level of background radiation in the UK at 100 times too high. And it turned out we had a decimal point wrong, and the whole of the disk had to be remastered at the absolute last minute. How did it begin? Well, it had begun, as I said, light-heartedly enough. I'd been asked, no, of course this isn't going to move on. I knew I should have used a Mac, not a PC. And did you know why this may have locked up? There we go. Push any button. Push any button, yes. Oh no, now what?
I think it just took a little while to recognise that it was something.
Well, it's definitely a PC. Okay, we've gone on about 30 slides, but that's fine.
The other part of that story about the missing decimal point is that one of the engineers from Logica, who were responsible for the software side, actually went into the half-inch ANSI tape and changed the item within the code to avoid having to rerun our mastering process again, which would have taken several days. So we had to remaster the disk, but at least we didn't have to rerun the whole of the process from the back. That's the second from the right.
Okay, we're just running all the slides backwards. We'll get there in a moment, and I shall actually start. I can't believe it. It's all right. It's almost there now. It's so unresponsive. I think it's the end of it. You're going to get a sense of déjà vu now when you look at each one. Okay, now will it stay there? So I was an ordinary television producer in the mid-80s at the BBC, and I was asked to make a series in 1984 begin to prepare the series for the upcoming 900th anniversary of the Domesday Book in 86. And I rather foolishly suggested to the commissioning people, well, wouldn't it be more fun, as well as making a 6-part series, to actually see if we couldn't do it again? I mean, what would William the Conqueror have given for the BBC Micro, now in so many schools, if he was going to do a modern Domesday? Wouldn't this be a fun thing to do? A lot of discussions went on, a lot of financial discussions, including with Baker at the DTI in those days, and with Philips, and with BBC Enterprises, and eventually a couple of million was raised, and a lot of support for the idea that yes, we would actually try for it. The idea of making a portrait of Britain in the 1980s that would be kind of one of these things that you bury under the ground and would be sort of there for a long time. You'll hear about the problems about that later. The problem was that we had no idea of how to do it. We knew about the BBC Micro, and I'd had it since the very beginning and was very enthusiastic about it and what it could do. And I sketched on paper what would be a marvellous thing to have as an add-on to your BBC Micro that would give you all these images and all the rest of it. And so we, without really knowing what we were doing, we got going. And we announced it and got a lot of interest. One of the press quotes was, "The BBC are planning nothing short of a revolution." And another one said, "One of the most ambitious cultural and technical projects of all time." Wildly over the top. But an interesting little thing in the small print of this piece is you notice at the end it says the cost of the discs and all the equipment needed to play them will be around £1,100. And that was a key part of our business plan, because BBC Micro was around 300 plus. Disk drives, hard disks were pretty expensive, and so if we could deliver a player to schools that invested that sort of level of money, sell the disc and the player for just around over £1,000, then we thought this would really have a huge uptake. But unfortunately the story doesn't end quite so well on that. So we started, and we went to schools and invited them, what do they think of this idea of collecting data? In the end, 14,000 schools said yes, they would be prepared to do that, and in the summer term of 95, each of them was allocated a tiny rectangle on the map, as George says, 4 kilometres by 3, basically the 4 by 3 ratio of a television screen, so that it would work well. And out they went surveying things. What did they survey? Well, they did some of the same things as Domesday Book. They did land use as an absolutely primary thing, so we could build up a digital map of land use. Had been done classically in the early part of the 20th century by some other popular surveys. We counted amenities, like the ones mentioned in The Guardian, dentists and post offices and so on, and were able to map them. We asked the children to interview and write about the lives of local people. Currently, life in the 1980s, they did quite a bit of history, but we didn't really so much want them to do that. And to take photographs. Now, most of this was pre-digital, of course, so the photographs were 35mm slides, which then had to be posted to us. The text was entered on their BBC Micro, and we actually had to write a little word processor for them to do that, because they didn't typically have one. So that was in digital form, but then the floppy disk itself had to be posted to us, because of course there was no networking capability. Just imagine how easy this would be today to do the same thing. But it kind of worked, and we got a mass of material which the team then had to assemble. In terms of the maps, of course that was equally difficult, because the whole idea was we would use the maps as a way of visually indexing all the material, whether that material was a piece of text, or a set of pictures, or data sets. But how to get those maps? The only way to do it was after a lot of negotiation with Ordnance Survey, as you can imagine, that we bought on paper all the different level, 150,000 and all the levels we needed, and then somebody, I forget who it was, cut them up and scanned them, stuck them together where necessary, where the drawings were, found various anomalies in doing that, but and then scanned them in, and then transferred them onto single frames, analog again, of the video disc, that would then be brought in as a person moved round, so a different frame would be played. And George, I think we'll try in a minute actually run your CD and see, shall we, and see if we can actually see what this looks like in practice. But it did give the effect that we wanted, that you could, as indeed you would do now on something like Google Maps, that you could zoom in, and on the map you could then overlay where are the post offices, what is the population density, or see the pictures or read the text, and so on. So a little note for the future, geolocation, important, note for the future, using maps as a visual index. Rather interesting for the future. We didn't get complete coverage of the country in our little rectangles. That's about the best we did, as you can see there. But I see from the Guardian this morning they only achieved 90%, so it is very, very hard to do, particularly in the rural areas. And by the end we were getting a bit desperate and trying to see whether scouts would go out into the Lake District and try and cover some of the squares, and the friends were bribed and one thing and another. But that was we never achieved a lot, but as you moved around the maps you were generally able to find something interesting close to where you were. What sort of statistics did this involve? Well, 14,000 schools, as I say, 24,000 map displays, 21,000 photographs I have here, but you say a bit more than that. Okay, well that's good. 8,000 data sets, because with the University of Essex we put a huge amount of social data on there from various national surveys. 21,000 mappable data sets, 30 million words, 70,000 lines of code. That was done by a team of 60 people, and we estimated, and it's a wonderfully rough estimate, but no one ever challenged how we worked it out, but anyway, that actually if you looked at every display, whether it was a data display or a map or a picture or whatever, it would, and you did a basic 8-hour day, it would take you 7 years to look at the whole thing. But, as I say, we had no way of storing it. So I went to consult, right before we even got the money or anything, to consult Andy Finney, who was the wizard within the BBC, at how you could potentially store this kind of things in different of these new emerging optical media. And in particular, as he'll explain, his work on video discs. And we had some original ideas how to do this with video discs that didn't have enough data in it to really work. But then Philips came back at a certain point and said, well look, we think actually we could put, as it were, a digital channel on this analog disc. So in ways I can't understand, you would still have the 50,000 plus frames of video, but you'd also have 300 plus megabytes of digital data that could be read off. In fact, it was a very, very early version of CD-ROM. It's called LV, LaserVision ROM, LV-ROM. And this is the picture of the very first moment in which we were in the labs in Eindhoven, and they were able to demonstrate digital data. You can't quite see the screen, but basic digital data is being read off a test LV-ROM disk for the first time using a BBC Micro, and indeed that is Jardine from Logica, and I think Roger Kelly as well. I'm sure Andy isn't far behind, though he didn't enjoy the flight, I seem to remember.
Sure.
Oh, yes. So that was the technology which Philips then worked on and created for us. This is some of the team that worked on the project, and many of them were actually pure editorial, nothing to do with the technical side. They were collecting some of the best photographs of the 1980s, some of the greatest pieces of writing. Things like, we went to a shop, I think it was a kind of convenience store, and photographed every single item with its price tag. Things that we knew would be interesting when you look back. And we did some walks around. Now at this point I'd like to see if we could demo your disc and see if we can see what the resulting disc looks like. What it looked like physically was this, when it was finally published, which looks kind of wonderfully large and clunky then, but in the...
How do we get the DVD drive? Mrs. Webb, can you turn on the engine please?
Totally untested. So as I say, it looks a bit big and clunky now when you're used to smaller discs. But at the time I suppose we were used to 12-inch, just about. It didn't seem quite so clunky. In fact, it seemed rather silver and rather sexy. Double-sided, so that, as we said, you've got twice the capacity there, about 600 megabytes in total. So it's sort of similar to a CD-ROM now in capacity. But you've also got the bonus of this 50,000 images, which either could be single-frame images, which is how we mostly use them, or could be sequential video, which is how we partly use them for the help disc, but also from a collection of, on one side of the disc, some of the great television moments of the 1980s that Andy put together for us. So we actually rather loved these things at the time, and they do sort of work. And I'm sure David will be talking about the lifespan that they have. At the time, I think we were talking it would last 50 years or something, but the ones I've got, and I've got a few of these, several of them don't work anymore. So the other very mysterious thing about them is, where are we going?
Well, just recognise the disc. I'm just trying to get the sunlight around.
The other wonderfully mysterious thing about it is that it's underneath it's red. So what to do with the label?
That one's a sandwich.
Oh, that's not true. Yes.
It's CDs that are left. But the video discs are two discs stuck together. And if you look at the edge, you can actually see the joints. No, it's a double-sided disc.
Yes, it's a double-sided disc, but so...
And it's red. Oh, you see under the label, I see what you mean.
Yes. So, should we put the right label on, as it were, that you see in,
The wrong way up.
or the wrong way up? Anyway, we decided to put the wrong, this says southern side, and actually it's the northern
Oh,
side.
we're in luck.
Oh, great.
Now, we don't have sound connected, so shall I just turn this microphone near to it?
We just plug the sound in and we don't let
All right. Get any of this?
Our country has been attacked by invaders from across the channel. Today the invaders are more friendly, and more than 15 million people pass through the port of Dover each year. But when they arrive, tourists need information about Dover or anywhere else in the United Kingdom. Now they can get that information in the form of maps, photographs and text at the touch of a button. This is the BBC Advanced Interactive Video. It's a combination of television monitor, microcomputer and video disc player. Much information you might need to know about the United Kingdom is recorded on these two video discs, the national disc and the community disc. Using the community disc, enter the name of the place you want to visit, and up on the screen comes the map of the area. To get a closer look, use the roller ball to move the arrow. And just press the button. There's Dover Castle. And that's the port. Move the arrow to photo. Press the button again, and up come pictures of the area. The castle, the New Eastern Docks. There's text as well, 20 pages of it for each place, which would give a visitor a very good idea of what the area's like. But where did all this local information come from? Well, it was the work of more than 1 million people from all over the United Kingdom who took part in a phenomenal event in 1985 called the BBC Domesday Project.
Fantastic.
Children from thousands of schools were involved, and not only did they provide information from the discs, the project enormously enriched their educational experiences.
We're going to make it stop. You're going to escape.
Yeah. Excuse me.
I think I probably recorded this with this rather high beat rate, but at least you say, hey, I've never seen that till that very moment, so that's pretty
Thank you very much, George. Great BBC production quality there. Not made by you. No. It's the new, younger generation. So that's give you some sense of what it looks like, and we'll be able to get much more from David in a minute as he emulates it. But so we made the deadline in 1986. It came out in time for the anniversary just, and it was very well received on the whole. It was shown all over the place. This is in Paris, or actually in Toulouse, where I'm showing it to President Mitterrand. And then Acorn and Philips went into their, and BBC Worldwide, I suppose, World Service, what was it called, BBC Enterprises, went into their selling mode, and this is where the problem started. Because Philips announced a few months before we actually finished, I don't know how many months it was, but not many, that R couldn't actually be a total package price of 1,100, but with special dispensations for schools, maybe it could be 3,000. And we were absolutely over a barrel. I mean, what were we going to do? Just stop doing it? Or not try and sell it? Or try and get another technology? And we did think about switching it into a CD-ROM based application, but that would have actually been more investment, which we didn't have. So from a commercial point of view, it was a very sad day when the Director General and the CEOs of Acorn and Philips stood up there and said, "This is great, this is terrific," and everyone was very, very excited, and then finally they said, "It costs about £3,000. They said, "How much?" And it just really wasn't going to fly, and so really at the end of the day only a few thousand were sold, and this kind of vision of libraries and schools with people rushing up to search things on it never quite happened. We did give a copy to the Public Record Office to put alongside the original Domesday Book, and it was there for a long time, and it can tell you if it's still there, I'm not sure. And so the whole question then of its archival value as a picture of life in the 1980s, then if it's not going to be useful, as useful as a reference item in the 80s itself, is it going to be increasingly interesting as time goes on and we want to look back? And I think many people using it really ask the question kind of why? What is this actually for? The screen that came up, the sort of opening screen of Doomsday after the title sequence, had a little box in it saying, "What do you want to know?" And you could basically put in anything about Britain. But then people thought, well, I haven't got a question at the moment, or there was no narrative with it, as it were. It was just a huge database of facts in a fairly storytelling way. And that was quite difficult for people. Now, note for the future, if a thing like that is online, like a Wikipedia, that's kind of very easy to get it when you want to, or Google Maps that's just there with a click when you need to check something, then that's really what it needed to be. But not being available all the time, something you had to kind of set up and start going, all the rest of it, that kind of really didn't work in my view. Since then, we're still doing it. I still work now for a non-profit called One World, and we're still trying to do exactly the same thing, but with the most modern technology, and for the most urgent of modern issues, which we take to be climate change. So this is One Climate. It's using the power of social networks for exactly the same thing, user-generated content, what people are doing to tackle their carbon footprints and how they can share that experience using social media, using geo-tagging so that people can see the groups, the people, the events, the meetings that are near them by moving around the digital maps. And of course, with the internet, with everything being digital, it is 10 times easier and maybe 1,000 times cheaper to do that. And we're also pushing beyond the, we weren't able to show you the virtual walks around towns and around houses that we did with Doomsday, but we're doing a modern equivalent of that now with the virtual worlds work, which again in the context of carbon footprint is hugely important in our view, because we're not going to be able to fly nearly as much in the future. So if we are going to want to meet, particularly internationally, then we believe virtual meetings is going to be the future. And so we've been holding for more than 3 years international meetings on the subject of climate change, using virtual worlds like Second Life and streaming video into them and getting interaction. So this particular meeting here, you've got the chair of the Congressional Global Warming Committee, Edward Markey, speaking to delegates in Bali from his laptop in Washington with avatars from more than 20 countries. And actually, well, more than 50 avatars, but from more than 20 countries, listening, putting questions to him and so on. And that, we believe, is kind of the future of some of the streams that began with Doomsday. So, was it worth it? Was it worth the £2 million? that BBC never quite got back, and neither did Philips, and neither did Acorn. Well, I like to think so. I think the technology that it pioneered was, as George kindly said, maybe helpful. We went on to start the BBC Interactive unit, which we ran for a number of years, which then in turn led on to the current BBC Interactive, so perhaps that was helpful. And some of the media mashups that we created, particularly between maps, video, pictures and data, turned out to be fairly seminal, as it turned out, with various lawsuits and patent things that Andy can tell you more about. You can't, right? No, it's always good if he hadn't signed. But above all, perhaps it's valuable because it does represent a huge record of life in the 1980s. But to make that work, of course, then you need to be able to preserve it and see it today, which is what we'll hear about from David. So I believe it was worth doing, and also in our experience, of course, it was 2 years of the most tremendous fun. Thank you very much.
So Andy is now going to talk about his section. I'll leave him to make his own introduction. The titles have changed, so...
Right, well, first thing, actually, let me attempt to get the PowerPoint running. Let's find a few buttons here, so excuse me for just one moment. In relation to the cost, there's one, at least from my memory, one rather sad thing that happened, which is that you may recall, those of us of a certain age, that one of the reasons why the BBC Micro and also the research machines, computer and Sinclair Spectrum were used in schools was that there was government subsidy towards the cost of their purchase, and part of the scheme that the DTI was running for the government at that time was providing that. Our bad timing was that just before we were about to launch, the government decided they would no longer subsidise hardware into schools, but would subsidise software instead. So instead of being able to get back $1.5 grand of the $3,000 cost, they were able to get back about £160 of the £320 cost of the discs. So that was a shame. I thought you'd appreciate that. Right. There's a big pointer. Bear with me while I click a few buttons. I'm going to say a little about the prehistory, first of all, I think. So I kind of call this technical considerations for a modern doomsday, because every so often I end up writing a piece that comes roughly this kind of ground. Let's just let the joys of PowerPoint fire up. And then in the spirit of the slightly convoluted way in which we've kind of done our timing in this presentation, I think I'm slightly cropped, sorry about that. I'm going to play the opening titles first. Rather, I will do if I press the right button. It's doing something. This PC obviously doesn't like Windows Media. Okay, we mentioned there were 2 discs. I'm hoping that there's a computer graphics fan amongst you who spots the in-joke in this. Just like I've been going to 3D movies lately, and so far every one of them involves a sequence where somebody gets a bat with a ball attached to it on a piece of elastic and does this out of the screen, which is an homage to a sequence from one of the 3D movies from the 50s, where someone, probably Vincent Price, playing the fairground parker, did this at the very beginning. There's a dramatic one at the beginning of Monsters vs. Aliens, which, incidentally, at the IMAX is the best 3D I've ever seen in my life. And if you want to see some 3D, go and see Monsters vs. Aliens at the IMAX. There are other 3D movies available. Okay, the joke. The joke is that in this computer-generated art gallery, there is a photograph of a real teapot. And if you're into it, you will know that every computer artist worth his salt at some point has attempted to generate a keyboard with his computer. So, okay, let's move on from those in-jokes and look at what we were doing. We had a huge number of resources. There are sort of moments when you think, well, have you got an infinity of riches or haven't you? Because I remember the first time Peter came to see me, we were discussing interactive documentaries. He said, well, by attaching a computer to a video disc machine so you can computer control with frame accuracy the video on this video disc, how much have you got to play with? Well, okay, 36 minutes, which, if you think about 36 minutes, by the time you've chopped it up into various sequences and branches, it's almost nothing. But it's also 54,000 frames. And it was the realization that there were 54,000 frames there that helped Peter go over this idea of suddenly thinking, well, yes, we can do a lot of things with this. We'd still photos, with maps. Somehow we need to be able to attach a data channel to this in order to put text and put a navigation structure around it. Where does this sort of come from? Well, a couple of years before the Domesday Project, I was working at BBC Video, and partly because there weren't very many of us, nobody else was interested, I ended up having responsibility for producing video discs, which were a new format. In Europe at that time, Philips had just launched LaserVision, the amazing vision of LaserVision, as they branded it, which was running in PAL, used discs that had pulse width modulation signal inscribed on them. A lot of journalists saw the word pulse and thought, that means digital. And you have to explain, well, actually, no, pulse width isn't digital. Pulse width is a form of analog. But just to confuse them, I then thought, well, hang on a minute. What we've got here is unlike video cassettes, and much more like broadcast television, we've got a system that has 5 megahertz bandwidth and a stability in the order of a few nanoseconds. Surely we could put teletext onto this. So we had to go. I had to close down BBC Two over lunchtime, believe it or not, because there are only 2 computers in the BBC that could insert teletext into a television signal, and they were sitting across the outputs of BBC One and BBC Two. Actually, it wasn't quite as drastic as it sounds, because BBC Two used to go to Tesco over lunch in the early 80s. And so, with a couple of tape machines separated by several miles, because for a whole variety of reasons, the BBC didn't possess the kind of tape machine with which we could record the teletext signal on 1-inch videotape, so we had to use the facility house at the West End. So the master tape was played back at the television centre, sent by a line to a facility house called, through the teletext inserter, and then that was sent to a place called TVI in Wardour Street, where it was recorded onto a specific type of videotape machine which could record the vertical blanking interval. I mean, it's a really arcane bit of information, but the vast majority of videotape machines don't bother to record the vertical blanking. That's the bit where the tape makes its way from one side of the head, goes across there. So there's a gap, basically. It takes a lot of effort and ingenuity to record that vertical blanking interval, so BBC did a lot of it with these machines for TVI. But we needed that. So we produced this disc. If you had this disc, you had a video display, and you connected it to the television set with the teletext chip in it, which a lot of television sets have. You could watch the disc, and you could turn on subtitles. There was also a whole teletext magazine full of ornithological information put together by the Natural History Unit in Bristol. Now, a couple of things came out of this. One was I had a slightly bizarre experience of demonstrating interactive video to the BBC Board of Governors with this. What I did was I hooked up a teletext adapter, a BBC micro, and a video display, so that the teletext adapter was reading the teletext magazine off the video disc, feeding it into the computer, so that there was actually an interactive program that was pulling data and video off the computer, mixing them together, putting one on top of the other on the screen, things like that. There was a kind of moment with the BBC Board of Governors, and 20 years later, I think they finally put it. What was slightly more interesting, and I don't know whether this is true, but if it is, I'm really quite proud of this. Somebody from Philips in Eindhoven many years later told me that his video disc department had used the Bird Book to persuade Philips management that there might be a consumer market for discs with digital data on. By that he meant compact disc audio. Sorry, but it meant compact disc audio, CD and CD-ROM. So that was sort of fairly influential, but in its way, this is the bit of the evolutionary tree that hits off at the dead end. And in 10,000 years, geologists will be trying to work out how this actually fits in with the bit where the real primates went off on the other side. Because when we first started looking at how we could combine video with data on Domesday Project, what we considered was using this portion of the baseband. Okay, imagine this is sort of 0 and this is about 5 megahertz. A couple of audio channels, analog stereo audio on the PAL discs, video here. Let's try full-frame teletext. So we did the numbers, and in theory, initially it looked as if full-frame teletext might work quite well. What was the number? Ooh, probably get something like 200 megabytes on the side of the disk. But there were some serious questions about how reliable it would be. The kinds of error correction that we'd need to retrofit on top of teletext to make it work would prove quite difficult. Teletext is quite interesting because standard teletext actually contains 2 levels of data correction. One of those levels being none. But actually, the bit across the top, if you know this, then forgive me for repeating it. If you don't, this explains why you can always read the page numbers even when the rest is rubbish. There's extra error correction in the stuff that you see across the top of the teletext image. There are Hamming codes in there to make it more rugged, because it was more important to be able to say, oh, I grabbed the page header, and then attempt to decode the page, than to be stuck trying to pull both the header and the data information out of the frames with the same level of naffness. So we had thought about whether we could use Hamming codes across the whole of the signal. But before we could get much further with this, Philips came back and said, well, actually, what we can do is we can replace those 2 audio channels with a subcarrier that carries a data channel. So here we have that. That irony, as Peter mentioned, that we have an analog disk carrying a digital data channel. There is error correction in this data, but it's attuned to the problems that video disks have. Those of you who are into error correction will know that you need to have a fair idea of the pattern of your errors before you can decide how to compensate for them. And the classic thing with any rotating object, and it's the same with the CD-ROM, is that you tend to get radial errors due to imperfections in the manufacturing process. That's one of the classic reasons why we get errors in the disk. And consequently, you want to make sure that your error and its correcting information are on opposite sides of the disk, so that it's unlikely that they'll both get hit by the same imperfection. Now, our full-frame teletext would have found that extremely difficult, but within the CD-ROM channel, that's what they do. And lo and behold, it actually proved to be extremely reliable, and the numbers are good too. 6 kilobytes per frame, which gave us 316 megabytes across the disk surface. And the other interesting thing was that, whereas with full-frame teletext, when you wanted to have data, you couldn't have audio. When you wanted to have data, you couldn't have video. School back did that. When you wanted to have data, you couldn't have video. With LV1, because your data was simultaneous with your video, you were exchanging audio for data. Then for our project that was full of still frames, which don't need audio, it was a perfect fit. So we could cover the surface of the disk with still frames and have audio underneath, not only have data underneath. And not only that, but the data could be positioned so that it was close to where its related pictures might be, so that the head seeks could be reduced. Big issues of latency and stuff. Horrified thinking about how slow these laserdisc systems are in terms of getting information off them compared to things that we're looking at now. So there are a few bits of background information as far as the video is concerned. I mean, it was kind of no-brainer from our point of view to use the BBC Micro, but it did have a lot of things going for it. It had PAL video timings, well, nearest damn it anyway, which meant that it was extremely easy to consider combining computer output with the video disc. As part of its output, it had RGB. Okay, it was TTL 5-volt high impedance, but it was still RGB. That was quite good, made very easy to work with. It was set up to enable sophisticated programming. The fact that we could use BCPL was an added bonus. It was overflowing with interfaces. It was relatively easy to expand if you, like Acorn, knew how to use all these things like the tube that were put into it. Perhaps last but by no means least, it had the backing of the Computer Literacy Project, which, so when we started, you got half your money back if you were a school. Just not to leave them out, there were versions of the Domesday system that used the research machines computer as well, because of those 3 machines that were used in schools. The RM80Z, perhaps, maybe I'm wrong about that, but 380, thank you. Had a lot of the same kind of capabilities, okay, different computer system, but you could run BCPL on it, so it was very simple. You could get the right sort of video out of it, fine. The Sinclair Spectrum was unfortunately useless in a lot of aspects in this list, and one of the reasons that Peter was far too gentlemanly to mention for some of the holes in the survey, notably the Greater London area, where we came across relatively few LEAs who had opted for the Spectrum instead of either the RML or the BBC, and unfortunately the ILEA was one of them. So we actually got very little back from Greater London, which was a big shame. There was nothing to actually do about it. There just wasn't there was no way we could send stuff backwards and forwards on those tiny little micro drive things that Sinclair used. It's a shame. But that's that. I'm going to say a little bit about one of the bits of the Domesday project that I produced, which I keep now turning up on Google. Things we call surrogate walks. We didn't come up with this idea. The MIT Media Lab, with money from the US Department of Defense, went around Aspen, Colorado, with a car looking remarkably like that thing that Google had been going around the world with, in order to produce what was called the Aspen disc. And this used video discs. Now, you may not remember, but video discs appeared in NTSC lands, particularly the United States, a couple of years before they appeared in PAL in Europe and the UK. We always had this sort of problem that in order to make things like videotape and video discs work in PAL, you have to rotate them more slowly or move them more slowly than you do when you're working in NTSC. So when you're trying to cram every ounce of bandwidth out of things, you kind of start off just managing to make it work in NTSC, but then you find you have to slow your media down for PAL. And so it stops working. And so you have to do more research to make it work again. And that's why in the analog world, PAL always tended to lag a little bit behind NTSC. And video discs are no exception. So MIT, as well as having a massive amount of money, had a couple of years of time with video discs to do this. The idea was that American troops could be orientated to new territories that they were going to invade by using this immersive video disc system where they could move around because they would go there and turn down there and so on. Why they would want to invade Aspen, Colorado is another question, but that was the reason why the DoD, or presumably ARPA, because it wasn't there, would cough up money. We decided to try something similar, and we went for an 8 viewpoint system. So you can imagine that you're kind of walking down this street, and you want to allow people to move. It's a bit of an orthogonal view of life. You have to remember that whereas these days we're used to seamless panoramas, you can pan around, there was no way we could have done that on an analog system. So basically, for every viewpoint, we had 8 photographs, which was done 16, we never finished. We did try 4 initially, and it doesn't give you enough coverage, so 8 was a reasonable compromise. But about a 24mm lens on 35mm gives you just about enough. And we wandered our way around some standard housing, looked at the different kinds of housing stock that were in different parts of the country, appeared in people's drawers, cupboards, so on. We went around a bit of National Trust land up in Scotland. That was about the best week's work I've ever done in my life. I remember walking when the sun came out, because of the 5 days, it chucked it down forever. On the 5th day, it got so wet that the cameraman was pouring water out of the Nikon F3 camera at the end of every session. I remember when the sun came out, walking down this road with a lock in front of me, trees all around, humming that Dire Straits song, "This Ain't Working, That's the Way to Do It," because it did feel as if that wasn't, well, anyway, that's a memory of the stuff. One of the other places we went to was Brecon. So here is Brecon. You will notice we have not obscured any car number plates, we have not blurred anybody's faces. Curiously enough, the only person who ever refused to be photographed for this was a jeweller. And I went as far as saying, well, look, I'll take a photo just of your shadow on the wall, just so that we can have something inside your... No. So anyway, he wouldn't do it. Everyone else was quite delighted with it, possibly. Sometimes they fit it together quite well. There's a panorama stitched together from these 8 views. That is one of the better ones. There are some where half the views are of blank walls and just you come up against a bus stop, kinds of things. But I followed a technique in my mind in directing these, particularly when it came to taking photographs of, if you like, the ephemera of the world that we're in. That if the photographer ever turned to me and said, "Why do you want to take a picture of this? Everybody knows what this is like." That doubled my reason for wanting to take a picture of it, because I'm still fairly convinced that the things that we lose are the things that everybody thinks are so common that they will never disappear. And on that line, I'm involved in a discographic project for an American record label. And it's really interesting to see just how many of the releases of this record label through the 50s and 60s are becoming very rare. That you think, okay, these are pieces of plastic which were sold in their tens of thousands, and that should provide preservation through diversity. But in fact, they are disappearing. More and more people think, I don't want this, and it goes into landfill. And there's masses of that. Somebody once told me that there are tens of thousands of rather interesting old records at the bottom of the channel, because they used to come over from the States as ballast. Jazz 78s, race records, stuff that now we think was incredibly interesting. But they used to just tip them over the side of the ship before they docked, because it was quicker than getting anybody to unload them. Really sad. But that's got nothing to do with Sorry at War. Couldn't possibly have imagined calling them virtual reality, but I suppose in a bizarre way, that's what they were. And Martin Porter, who was a software consultant who's famous for his natural language parsing, he actually came up with an algorithm to do the laws. And basically, the tagging mechanism for these is that when you're at a point and you're looking in a particular direction, there is a cell of data in the data table which may or may not give you information about where you can go next. So it's very much a daisy chain kind of thing. And I remember writing some bizarre program on a BBC Micro to enable me to enter all these frame numbers in by hand. I should have kept the program actually, because it might prove useful just to decode the thing. But anyway, there, hopefully you'll see a bit of that in the emulation. I'm going to say a little about my bit of the Domesday Redux project, for which we can all thank blame Lloyd Grossman, standing there holding up a Domesday disc and saying this is a perfect example of obsolescence. And that jogged quite a few memories. Now, in terms of the National Archives of Public Record Office, you remember Peter showed that photograph of a disc being handed over to the keeper. Well, that triggered one very interesting thing, because the National Archives they're not only not allowed to throw anything away, there are boxes full of dust that used to be a manuscript, but they're still not allowed to throw them away. They're also not allowed to let them leave the building, but that's another story. But also, they have an obligation to preserve and make them accessible. And that was the excuse by which I got a call from the PRO one day asking if I could do anything to help them resurrect bits of the Domesday Project. Now, at about that time, Chameleon was starting, and I won't say anything about that because I'm going to get a full Monty from that in a moment. But the area that I wanted to look at was the mechanism for retrieving the analog video information that was on the video discs at the highest practical quality. Now, this is stored on 1-inch C format analog master tapes, and as clip art goes, that's actually a remarkably good picture of the C format VTR. C format 1-inch has the distinction of possibly being the worst quality format any broadcast organisation has ever used. It's one of those sad instances where, for a whole variety of quite good reasons actually, broadcasters went from an extremely high quality but pig of a system to run, i.e. quadruplex, 2-inch stuff, to a system that was extremely easy to run, but which produced rather indifferent quality, especially the more you copied it. And videotape editing, of course, during this period is done by copying. So we had these 1-inch analog master tapes, which, although they were master tapes, they were kind of third generation, most of them. What they were a combination of were mostly a whole bunch of stuff that was done by the Auckland University Production Centre, who had a video rostrum and a slide scanner. With the video rostrum, which was basically television cameras in those days were like a small car. So you can imagine, if you imagine this small car nose down on a hoist on top of a flat bed onto which someone has managed to stick a glued together version of the one that's on a survey map. Discovering one of those interesting things about maps, which is if you try and join them together, they often don't fit. This was explained to me with the analogy, well, here are two different cartographers. The representation of the road on a 1-inch map is substantially thicker than the road really is in real life. So it's up to the cartographer where, in relation to the actual position, they position the mark that delineates the road. And so you do literally get some instances where the road comes in here and it goes out the other side of the joint there, because the two cartographers have used that line and that line, right? These crazy little things that you never notice. We don't have that problem with digital maps in the OS anymore, always assuming we can pay for them. So all that was edited together on a special videotape machine which was designed as a Sony machine that was specifically designed for assembling videotape disc masters. It could edit single frames together. Editing single frames of analog video was not as trivial as it might have first have seemed even to the experienced engineers. We ran into probably the most arcane technical problem I ever came across, which is something called sync to subcarrier phase. And I want to attempt to explain what that means. But if you understand it, you'll probably know what it is. But what it meant was that you couldn't, even if you could edit these things together, you couldn't necessarily always play them back. So it was vitally important that any machine that was editing the single frames together was set up correctly. Now, if the sync to subcarrier phase was wrong over a normal edit, what you tended to get was a tiny little disturbance at the top of one frame immediately after the edit, which is fine if you've got moving pictures, you can get away with that. For a single frame assembly, it basically means you've got a whole load of pictures that you can't use. So it wasn't trivial. The work that the Open University Production Centre were doing was not only fairly innovative, but it was certainly not natural. So they were assembling all these slides, which had to be assembled in the right place. The documentation had to say where they were, so they could be matched to the computer program, the navigation to say where they were, and similarly for the maps. So there we have 3 out of the 4 master tapes. The 4th master tape contained the side 4 news clips, which were linear moving video, much easier to handle. No one seemed to know where the Domesday Masters originally were, because they had been kept by the Open University Production Centre. They weren't put into the BBC library system. For the future, we'll come back to this issue about ownership. And when the Open University Production Centre was closed, there was no official mechanism for keeping these master tapes. They didn't have BBC tape number. Fortunately, they were given to Sir Peter Armstrong, and as a result, they were kept safe. So when the time came and I was ringing around saying, anybody know where these are, I turned up the side 4 master tape, which had got a BBC number in the BBC Worldwide Library, and the other 3 had got from Peter. So that's the first point. The question is, what we want to do is we want to convert these into digital video in such a way that we've got a reasonable hope of preserving them, at least for a few years, and to get the best quality that we can. There are a lot of funnies about working with analog video. Frames have an interrelationship with each other because the colour information in a frame is determined by a phase relationship between a subcarrier in the video itself and a reference burst at the start of every line. It's extremely critical that this relationship carries through the whole process. What also it means in terms of PAL is that the sequence, the phase sequence of the video repeats itself every 8 fields. Which actually means that, strictly speaking, you can't just edit any PAL frame to any PAL frame. To make it work correctly, you have to edit within the 8-field sequence. NTSC is only 4 fields because it doesn't reverse its phase in alternate lines. What the AL means. So there needed to be a lot of thought put into how to decode this PAL to make the digits work better. Just taking a still frame isn't going to work. Because of that 8-frame sequence, and this happened with the video discs as well, if you sit on the still frame, you can't just read real PAL out of it, because a PAL decoder won't decode it. The phase sequence is wrong. It's only got a quarter of the phase information it should have. So what all systems do, professional and amateur, is they go colour under. They take the original colour information and they recode it at a much lower subcarrier frequency and shove it back into the signal in such a way that it will survive the next part of the process, so it can be pulled back out again. But in the course of that going colour under, you lose a substantial amount of the resolution of the information, because your colour subcarrier has gone from 4.43 megahertz down to something like 1.2 megahertz or even less. So you could imagine you've thrown away a substantial amount of that data. There isn't as much high-frequency data as you might like, of course, because 1-inch being a fairly crappy system, it wasn't that sharp in the first place, but there's still a little more than that you want to keep. Now, here comes coincidence number 1. I phoned BBC Research Department and discovered that the guy who was running the research department had been engineering liaison on the Domesday Project, a man named John Astor. He hadn't, at that point, retired, and he sort of said, "Oh, I think we can handle this for you. Yes, this is something that we should do as our part of our public service. You need to talk to Richard Russell. He's just built this wonderful PAL decoder, which can take PAL composite video in and produce the nearest thing you'll ever get to the original component video out of the other end, getting rid of all the PAL artifacts along the way." Richard Russell, the man who was responsible for a fairly number of writers at BBC Basic, for example, he again was a key person, more in the BBC Micro than the Domesday Project, but again someone that I'd known for a long time. Went to see Richard, discussed this problem, looked at the transform decoder, shoved zone plate pictures into it, looked at zone plate pictures out, came up with a problem. The transform decoder needs the 8 fields of the 8-field sequence in order to properly decode the PAL. So if you feed single individual frames into it, so that there is no relationship between the 4 frames, it won't do, it won't handle it. Okay, what do you think I should do, Richard? Well, he said, why don't you consider, can you re-edit the tapes to repeat each frame 4 times? Can you have a think about how we can do that? And then we can run it through, and then we can edit it back again afterwards once it's in the digital domain. So I went away, I had thought about that, on the drive back home from Kingswood Warren. When I got back, the phone rang, and Richard was on the phone and said, don't worry, I've reprogrammed the decoder to work with 2 fields. This was like half an hour. And he had done. We went back, looked at zone plates again, and discovered that there was a tiny reduction in quality, but it was so insignificant that even on a zone plate, you'd have to peer to look for it. And so, yes, another wonderful coincidence, and someone who was willing to go that extra mile. We had the ability to take our single frames and convert them back into components. And once we got them in components, we could digitize them. The actual process to do this was slightly convoluted because the 1-inch analog tape machine was at the BBC Library in Brentford. So what we did there was I went in and copied the tapes onto a digital tape format which was still composite. One of the 4 tapes was showing some signs of damage. Not necessarily visually, but when you play back an analog tape machine, one of the things that the Pro tape machine will display is the waveform that's actually coming off the tape. And in that waveform on that particular tape, we could see a few little funnies, little things like scratches coming out, which oddly enough got better every time we played it. So we decided, okay, we'll run the tape through twice and then we'll copy it, which we did. And there are one or two places where you can see a little damage in the end result, but in general, it worked well. The other two tapes were perfect. The side floor moving material had never been a particular problem, but we ran that through the side as well. So that was put onto a tape format called D3. The D3 tape was then taken to King Gregorian, played through the transform decoder into a pair of digibeaters, and so we had two tapes. One wasn't a clone of the other. We had two simultaneously produced tapes for each of the sides, one of which was sent to the Public Record Office and became part of their inventory, and the other one was sent to the BBC, and I don't know what they've done with it, but hopefully they've provided it. The other thing that also happened was off one of the digibeaters, it took a DV copy, and the JPEGs that are floating around that sent to George and have been used on the 1986 project all came off the DV copy. Simply from a practical point of view, it's just, there's a point where DV was good enough. And it almost is. DV does have intra-frame compression, but not very much head. And the end result was fine. I'm starting to think that within the next 5 years, I'm going to need to persuade both the BBC and the National Archives to copy those digibeaters, but onto what I'm not sure. If digibeater is still a used format, then let's put them on other digibeaters. So one of the things about Sony is that they have been around for a long time. I've seen more instances of things getting lost off hard drives than I've seen of tapes getting lost. But I've seen lots of tapes getting lost too. Which is why whatever happens, it's going to happen twice. However, I've got a few years to work. So a few of the things to recovery risks that I've discovered in working on this process to sort of wind up. A will and ownership within an organisation that has some connection with the material helps a great deal. The will in the case of my preservation was from people in BBC Engineering who were willing to do things. Now they've all retired, they're gone. The actual window which we could have done it was very small. The window for the transform decoder was even smaller, within 6 months. That particular project was finished because the BBC Library considered it had transferred all its plant material to digital. And Richard is now at the BBC, retired, so that's all gone. Ownership being important. I think in this case, George, that's your role in this particular drama. And for better or for worse, it's nice to see somebody in some kind of ownership position. Of course, there are several of us who, without having any legal ownership, feel moral ownership, such as myself, Peter, and others. And there are even people who have no connection whatsoever with the project, who occasionally pop up and want to do things. And at this point, I should pay tribute to the late Adrian Pearce, who reverse engineered the whole of the community disc onto a PC, basically to help his wife with the school project. Sadly, this is where mortality comes into it. Adrian died very suddenly recently. As far as I know, because he put rights management on his code, we can't actually access the code that he wrote from the PC for the project. However, I know Kevin has taken the stuff from Adrian Pearce's workshop off to virtually, and hopefully we'll see something from that. Okay, you need access to source materials. Obviously, the format can be important. You often end up needing access to obsolete hardware and software. Sometimes that's just a question of finding some facility that still has it. I think certainly still within my lifetime there will still always be some place in London where you can get a 2-inch tape play, and similarly in the United States. That raises one very interesting point here, actually, to do with hardware, which I expect you guys in computer conservation have the same issue over there. Which is, we get these funny windows with equipment as the technology becomes more sophisticated. This is one of the significant differences between 2-inch videotape and 1-inch videotape. The guy at Brentford said a very interesting thing to me, which is, look, you see this enormous, clunking, great piece of mechanism here, this 2-inch machine, which is 25 years old. It's still working. If a component fails, then if it's an electronic component, we can remove it and replace it with a soldering iron. If it's part of the mechanics, then a guy with a lathe can remake it. Look at that 1-inch machine over there. It's full of integrated circuits. If that breaks, we can't build it again from scratch. And that's, you know, that sticks in my mind. I have an ongoing slight millstone of a project from the National Archives, resurrecting some material recorded at the end of the Second World War using an audio format called record graph, which was audio put onto 20-foot loops of film leader, which used to record the war trial of General Erich von Manstein. And basically I got a man to build from scratch a machine to play back this material, because the material is analog. If it's analog, there's a good chance you can build something to do. See, as a complete digression, this is why I worry about people suggesting you have digital radio switch on. Because I think in the final analysis, when the chips are down, somebody out there's got to be able to build crystals. And have you ever built a damn crystal cell? I bet you've never even built an FM crystal cell. Okay, but that's just me. It's a sign of age. And the final one, I think this has been raised before, it's rights. Now, it's not just a theoretical issue. In the case of Doomsday, it's a theoretical issue. In a sense, a magic wand can be waved, there's already up in the air that says the material can be made available. But I occasionally have these nightmares about going to the Louvre, and in the room where the Mona Lisa is, there's this brick box that's been built around it, and across the front someone has written in big letters, digital rights management. And the idea is that, yes, we have all this cultural material, and it's there, yes, you can see it, but you can't really see it because the digital rights management is no longer accessible, and therefore we can't get at it. Digital rights management frightens me more than most. So anyway, that's enough of my hobby horses. I would also like to pay tribute to people on the Domesday team. One person in particular, this man here, Roger Kelly, was the technical project manager. Originally I was the technical project manager. For a variety of reasons I moved back into content. Roger was the man who, when Peter said jump, Roger said how high. And I think a lot of his effort needs to be recognised. Roger was also the person who told me the 8 stages of a project from inception to after completion. And the only one I can remember is number 8, which was praise and reward for the non-participants. In which case, what I will finish with is to show you a dub of a piece of 35mm film that we shot in Chester on a cold day as part of the opening titles for the community disc. If you look closely, you'll see a young version of me holding a clapperboard, and I didn't write what's on the clapperboard, but I still cringe every time I see it. So let's see if this runs. Hard disk space. That was a mistake. No, this problem with this PC not liking Windows Media. Anyway, the clapperboard actually does say Doomsday DII. Sorry about that. Yes, that ran in. That ran in. Okay, well that's my meander through some of the technical aspects. I'm hoping that we will have time for a Q&A afterwards, but I'm not disappearing at the end. Anyway, the other joke I made earlier that nobody got is that, having seen most punch cards, I thought, well, if I'm making some statement, should I begin everyone with the letter H? Some fortune program time. Okay, right, forget about this. Thank you very much for your attention.
So that's the title I chose. I will explain the use of the word aggressive in due course. Sorry, I'll have my glasses on. This tiny screen is such that I need. So that's me, and I work at Information Systems Service at Leeds University, or used to. I'm still officially an honorary member of staff, but really I'm ex because they don't pay me anymore. But the BBC Micro, as we well know, is still remembered, and just a few weeks ago, I came across this advert, and I was quite amazed. I found this in April 2009. So don't underestimate the quality of the human memory with regard to the BBC Micro. But let's look at the Domesday system. Here you've got a picture of the equipment. There's one of the 12-inch discs. This consists of the BBC Master with a ROM to drive the laser vision video system, which has been modified, and I think part of the trouble with the price tag was that we weren't really operating in the consumer marketplace. The Comedian project was about digital preservation by emulation. I must point out, our number one aim was not to rescue the BBC Domesday, but we were trying to test a hypothesis that you could take original digital stuff and preserve it by emulation techniques. We needed a challenging demo. At that stage, I wasn't really aware that the pictures on the BBC Domesday were really only sort of digital, because basically variable mark space is sort of analog, but for these purposes it was still a good enough challenging thing to go for, and we felt if we successfully carried that across technology, we would have something that lots of people were already aware of. And so I demonstrated a proof of concept rather than an industrial strength product. So let's see if we can actually get it to roll. And it was rolling earlier, but we were swept off the face of the earth by other pieces of PowerPoint. I've got fingers and toes and everything else crossed now. So, yeah, doesn't look so bad at all. So there you've got your BBC Master switched on, and you hold down the shift key and you press brake, and you get your prayer mat out and things start to happen. Now, there's a video sequence at the front, and we're not very good at video in our emulation, so we press escape and tell it. We've already seen a better example earlier, and so here we are. And this now isn't a movie shot, this is real, it's working. The yellow arrow is the one that matters. And part of the problem was emulating the tracker ball. But there we are, and on to the map. And if you go to the end in Lancaster, which I suspect you don't do very often, then you get a picture of a place called Settle. And when you press that, you get closer map. And that's the map zoom they were talking about. And if you click the photo, there you see, what you should see in a moment, the market square of the small market town of Settle in the Yorkshire Dales, which I left this morning at shortly before 6 a.m. And here's another view, and I was ever so pleased to discover that that's our house between the two. Well, let's go back. So that's the community disc, Community South. Let's give credit where it's due, you see, because I'm standing up here, but the truth of the matter is that much of this code was written by Derek Sargent, who's here somewhere, but there he is. Other contributors, Paul Wheatley and Phil Mellor, also deserve to be recognised. Paul Wheatley works for the British Library now and may become key to preserving this stuff longer term. So what are the conclusions from the project? First, we've got no faith in One Life Media. You guys have been chucking these tapes around, and just the sheer custody of them has been a problem. And the media may, sorry, the big disc is gone now, but the big disc we were told would last 50 years. But you remember the picture of the equipment to read it. How many years do you think that will last? We have one, but we have to treat it very carefully, and the eject mechanism doesn't work. When you want to change the disc, you've got to unscrew the top and take the disc out. So we felt you should preserve material in abstract form, byte streams. Frankly, a stream of bytes, a file, is the sort of thing that can last forever. You preserve the original bytes. Is now sometimes deciding what constitutes the original bytes is non-trivial, but having preserved them, then you also preserve the software to achieve access. And you can copy that stuff forever because digital copies are perfect. There's no difference between the PowerPoint file that Andy brought on a flash memory stick and the PowerPoint file that he copied onto the hard disk in the laptop. They're absolutely identical. And that, I think, is the key to keeping stuff indefinitely. But of course you need some kind of custody in long-lived institutions. Long-lived institutions like, for instance, the Open University, well, somehow they managed to shut down the organisation that was storing them. So deciding what are long-lived institutions is perhaps not trivial. And we also were very careful to make the distinction between preservation and access. And the stuff that went on in the early days of Domesday was about access. And I'm not criticising it for that, but just saying that preservation didn't quite happen as smoothly as it might. Well, perhaps it's just almost difficult. You see, the story so far, now this is a slightly jaundiced version of the story. Now that I've heard Andy and Peter, I maybe could give you a better version, but I haven't had time to redo the PowerPoint. But the laser vision system and the discs went to the Public Record Office, as it was then called. You see, it couldn't even keep its name constant. The BBC kept some, I thought they were Betamax tapes, so I'm sorry Andy, I can correct us in the future. The National Archives, they changed the name by then I think, sponsored a website called Domesday1986.com. And it was made from digibeta, copied from the originals, forget the word Betamax. And it provides access to the information with a different look and feel, but a modern look and feel. So I think in many ways it's a very valuable way to go. It only works on the community discs, like the one we just saw, the Community South disc. Now, Domesday1986.com then was subcontracted, as far as I can see, to a firm called Long Life Data. Now, a firm with a name like that has to give you confidence. They're not going to look. And it was implemented by this really nice guy called Adrian Pearce, whom I never met, but with whom I exchanged lots of emails and one or two telephone conversations. And the Domesday1986.com domain name is registered in his name. It's registered in his name now. I don't know if any steps have been taken to renew it because it doesn't have long to go. Now the Chameleon stuff, after the project shut down, I wanted to make it work on the net, and I've enhanced it so that it can use the images from Adrian Pearce's website. And Adrian and I negotiated special URLs to use with his website so that the images could come down the wire so that we could actually run the emulator without having to fill a gigabyte or two of disk space with images. And this website was funded by a direct debit on Adrian Pearce's credit card. It really was! Now, when Adrian died, I was sorry to hear the news, but I was really glad that the website kept working. But I didn't actually know that nobody noticed, and eventually, when the renewal came up, I'm afraid that's what we got. And it's a shame. I'm hoping we can get it back. But our emulation, the original version, the idea was to use a public emulator of the BBC Micro, and a guy called Richard Gelman should have credit here because he actually wrote the one that we used. The key thing was to write an emulator which was an add-on to emulate the laser vision system. And of course that's where all the data was, and we were about using emulation to make data preservable and hence continuously accessible. Well, the hardware, it plays video stored as 1 frame per track, as Andy's already told you, and it shows a still image basically while sitting on the same track, and it just comes round and round and round. And there are 2 analog video signals, one coming out of the laser vision player, which is making the picture of people walking, not walking, standing still, and the other one, which is this stuff coming out of the BBC micro, sticking captions on and things like that. And then also, there's all this binary stuff, the digital data that Andy was talking about, and that is read on the BBC micro by a kind of SCSI interface, and it's used for overlaying software and accessing the non-video data, like the textual stuff. And here's a picture of it, which I'm sure people on the front row can correct, but basically you've got the master computer here. It's got a control line that allows it to make the disc player move to different tracks and such like, and the binary data comes back to display the textual information which goes down this video channel. Meanwhile, whatever video image is spinning around on the disc there is going out through that video mixer to appear on the TV monitor. So our emulation, we took each video track and we made a pixel array in a file. Because our hypothesis, what we're trying to suggest is that you want to get your preserved digital information to be as close as possible to the original. And you might wish to change it for access purposes, but for preservation. So that we basically had a frame store, and we just took the outputs from the frame store. In fact, I ran some of it in our 3rd bedroom with it sitting there overnight, churning away. And the screen emulation in the BBC micro emulator was enhanced to mix in the image from the selected image track, and that's how we implemented that bit of the system. And then movie playback, well, now we're pretty bad at that. And in particular, because you're taking every frame and rendering it, we only do every 5th frame. It looks jerky, but at least it does finish in a finite length of time. And all the binary data blocks from the audio tracks were actually gathered together in one single file for each of the 4 disc sides. And that then is accessed just by using the C routine LC, so you can just pick stuff out of it, just like SCSI picks stuff out of a disk drive. When we switched onto network data, we still use the same public emulator, and we enhanced the laser vision emulation so that the video disk abstraction now becomes, each video track becomes a JPEG file, and the JPEGs are delivered over the net and converted to pixel arrays on the fly. Now this, of course, was super for interfacing to Adrian Pierce's stuff, because we pulled Adrian's JPEG file and then expanded it out, and that's what that little process is doing that I started up right at the very beginning while George was talking. And then the binary data blocks were delivered as just application on text stream chunks of stuff from a rather special purpose web server. So we've got an emulation architecture with data from the video disk served over HTTP, and the emulator is running on a client machine, but all the data is on the server. And it's written in C++, which is Derek's stuff, and Java, which is my stuff, because Java's got some very convenient library routines for jiggling around with images and scaling them and processing JPEG files. So let's have a look at the national disk, which I said our laser vision player has difficulty changing the disk. Here it's really very easy. You choose Laserdisc and then you move down to national side A, and that's changed the disk. It's much quicker than taking the disk out. And so now we do shift and break, and so long as the gods are on my side, your house will get rubbed out. And here we are, Domesday Project, the national disk. Now, of course, you've seen this already, but this really is running as an emulation. And so let's press escape again. And there we are in the Domesday gallery. Now, I did say it wasn't a production version, so there are some things that don't work, and if it crashes on us, we'll have to restart it. But this is for live and for real. Now, you can remember the 8-point walks that Andy talked about. Well, let's turn 45 degrees to our left. And we're in this sort of, remember that gallery? And can you see, look, there's the doorway through to the next bit. Now, unfortunately, we can't walk straight to that. We need to do another 45 degrees to the left. Go on. I'm sure I told you to do that. And then a step forward, and then 45 degrees to the right. And now we're looking straight down. Now, of course, it's quite easy to get lost in this walk around, but fortunately we're provided with a plan. And here we're, so, can you see, we're actually there, looking down that corridor into society. So we go back to the main screen, and we walk forward, step into the corridor, step out of the corridor. I'm going to go a step forward, one more. Now turn to your left, and now we're looking into the streets here. Now this is one of these walk arounds. So this virtual gallery, let's look again at the plan. We're sort of in this gallery, like here, looking out of the window. But the difference is that it's a kind of TARDIS world, and so we can actually walk out of this window. And here we are in Brecon. And we can, it says turn left for more information. You get a special photo with some words overlaid on it. In fact, if we just turn ourselves round another 45 degrees, and here we see, I used to have an Austin Maxi a long time ago, and you get a good image. And now, Brecon doesn't really have one of these. If we step back, we see what we've done a backward step, and there you are looking at Brecon. And now you do a forward step, and now you're about to walk back into the gallery. This is the TARDIS effect. And then you look at that, and you can see here we are. And if we do a couple of left turns, then go forwards, we can go left and look at an urban street scene. But let's step back into the gallery, because I think the walk, so heck, you get this no move pocket, and unfortunately you have to wait till that message disappears before you can do anything. Let's just check where we are, because what I'd like to do is get over to daily life, because there's some really nice stuff there. So we need to do 1, 2, 3 right turns and march. So I think there are quicker ways if you really know your way around, but at least you don't challenge the software quite as much. Now we're standing at the crossroads, turn to the left, and we're looking at the wall of the join between the two walls at right next to each other. Now we step out into consumerism, turn to our right, on, turn to our right, and then here we are in daily life. And here's a really interesting thing. Notice it's always raining, just like it really is amazing how much rain there is on this. I mean, there's a picture of the British climate. I know there's climatic data, but the anecdotal evidence from the pictures is that it rains 75% of the time. So we're now heading off down the street. When you get to the pub, you turn right, and into a tower block called Trellick Tower. Now, when I got this here for the first time, I did a flip onto Google and put Trellick Tower into Google. And I was amazed to discover there's a Wikipedia page about Trellick Tower. It's not wholly complimentary, but I just thought you might. And we're now in the lobby. I'll explain about the magnifying glasses in a moment. And we're going to turn left, and here's the lift in front of us. We step into the lift. This is a magic lift. If you go around, you can learn about the love life of the youth of 1986. But when you step out of the lift, wonderfully, it's actually already gone up several flights. And we're now walking down the corridor, and there's a door on the right, and we're going into this flat. And you have to go until you're hitting the wall, turn right again, down the steps, turn left, into the lounge. And now, this is another magnifying glass. Now that means we've got a close-up photograph. So here's 1980s sound system. Admittedly, this is in a council flat. We've got a stockbroke house for you later. And if you walk forward, you can see some lighting systems of the era. Do you want to look at the telly? I think this telly is a 1970s vintage telly. I bet the stockbroker has a better telly than that. And I'm turning around again now, to my left. There's the guy who lives there. And we can pop back out into the hallway. I think it's gone too far back home. Turn right. Now, as a cyclist, you might think that's an irrelevant remark, but there's the handlebars of his bike, really. And we can go round and up, turn left, and I'm afraid the way out is to keep walking. And we're back on the corridor now, through the doors. I think we need to go another one. No, we don't. Just have to wait for that message to disappear, and then we get in the lift. Step into the lift. Down it goes. Now, if we step backwards out of the lift, I know we don't normally get out of the lift like that, but it does actually save a bit of walking around. And we're now in the lobby, and there's a Russian agent just there. So, I don't think the BBC knew they were being spied on with this enterprise, but the truth of the matter is, it's all sorted by the KGB. They've got, and actually, you're not that far back from home now. There you are, into the museum. Left. Hang on, I need to look at the plan now to remember where we are. There we are, so we need another left turn. Tell you what, let's go back and look at some serious conclusions, and then, depending on time at the end, we can play with that a bit more. So, I said we should make a distinction between preservation and access. You see, preservation is about the long-term retention of the ability to access the intellectual content of a digital resource. So that not necessarily means just to see pictures. Access, on the other hand, is about using the current technology to access the intellectual content of a digital resource. And of course, the important thing to remember is that that term current technology is going to mean different things at different eras. And so, if we sort of confuse the two, there's a technological drift might turn out to be a problem. And without a doubt, if you don't have preservation, your access will just eventually be lost. As technology evolves and direct debits on credit cards expire. But we need stewardship. So copies of the discs are lodged with the BBC. Well, I thought they were, but I'm not sure now after listening to them. I know the British Library's got a copy because we use the British Library discs rather than our own discs because we thought they might have been less bashed around. And the National Archives certainly has some, though they were called the public record books at the time when they were given them. But really, you should abstract data. So who's got that? Well, I've got a copy, some of which is stored at Leeds University, and some of which is on the flash memory stick that's sticking inside of this laptop. Now, long life data links, well, I'm not sure about that anymore. Maybe they've got something, maybe they haven't.
I think they gave it to Kenny.
Yeah, sorry, and he's writing some stuff on a disk, and we're going to see if we can make any sense of it. But I'm not that optimistic. But I'll have a go. And the National Museum of Computing, which is what that's posh speed for Kenny. Yeah. Aggressive rescue, I said. Now this is a term I first learned from a lady called Anne Van Camp, who at the time was the boss of the Research Libraries Group, which is now merged with OCLC in the States. This was back in the late 90s. When preservation is in the public interest, but is discouraged by the copyright owner, then that's when they really talk about aggressive rescue. Because you see, the technology will be obsolete long before copyright expires. And so the idea is you copy the published data into some kind of abstract form and keep it long term. Now, it wasn't quite an aggressive rescue because I'm not so sure that anybody was fighting us and telling us we shouldn't do it. But it used much of the technology. In particular, we worked from the published material. That was the idea, you see. It's where you come across a resource whose technology is gone, but you work from the published material. I do much appreciate the efforts of Andy and Co. to go back to the originals and get some really good images for the website. But we, as I said, work from the published material. And in fact, I don't recall us asking for permission at the outset, but given that we did actually own a copy of the system, we were allowed to make copies of it for backup, for preservation, you know. So in a sense, that's what we were doing. So we claimed that that gave us a copyright justification. But let's look at copyright. A bilateral view. The law protects the interests of the creator of a work for a limited period, and the meaning of the word limited can be redefined if Walt Disney is one of your sponsors. In return for the works becoming publicly available afterwards. And somebody told me recently that historically the Copyright Act was first enacted in order to guarantee against things being lost, rather than to make sure that Walt Disney Studios didn't go bust. After all, it's all owned by Steve Jobs anyway now. And many copyright owners seem to be more aware of the first half of the bargain than they are of the second. And until we've got digital legal deposit, it will continue to be a problem. What about my wisdom of hindsight? Well, the BBC used bleeding edge technology. In fact, I think sometimes the wounds were quite deep. Now that's fine for collection and for access. But preservation should depend only on long-lived concepts. And after due consideration on the Chameleon and preceding CCS project, we very much came to the conclusion that hardware solutions never endure. Hence my opening remark with no faith in long-lived media. The media might last, but the gadgets to read it never do. Abstractions may just be immortal. You know, there are lots of files around now which are identical bit-for-bit copies of files that were started on quite different pieces of magnetic media, and they're copied many times. In fact, the difficulty with this perfect copying is that the digital rights people now are trying to make it so that the copies aren't perfect. They put some deliberate messing so that it'll stop working. Of course, this does assume the continuity of civilization. When I started work on this, I took this for granted. But with increasing threats of climate catastrophe, Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal, or is that Ryle? I get mixed up. He says we've only 50% chance of getting to the end of this century without a collapse of civilization. So what to do now? Preserve the disk contents and files, not the disks. preserve relevant source text in files, but there's a question as to whether you can find it. Preserve relevant documentation, and can we find digital versions of documentation? It's quite clear a lot of this was produced on View on the BBC Micro, and with the emulator we can actually run it again, but I don't think we've got the originals. And where? Because once you've done that, we're back to these long-lived institutions. Well, lots of copies keep stuff safe. There's a project from Stanford, I think, called LOCKSS, which is an acronym, lots of copies keep stuff safe. By the way, talking of acronyms, Chameleon was creative archiving at Michigan and Leeds, emulating the old on the new, and it was a collaborative project with people in Michigan who, because they hadn't known the original, were quite good sort of as a test bed for what the preservation might actually be worth in the long term. The British Library, well, they're certainly interested in this kind of thing. In fact, they've recruited Paul, and he won't let it drop. The National Archives, they clearly have a responsibility, and given they're not allowed to throw stuff away, they seem to be ideal. The only snag is, it's not only not throwing it away, it's making sure you can still read it. Of course, the other thing we have to do is stop spewing out lots of CO2. I think that's actually as big a danger to the longevity of this stuff as all the digital threats. And there we are. If we go back to the plan, I thought we might have a quick look at the stockbroker who's over here. Can you see all that leafy stuff out there? So you have to turn to your right and step forward. Oh no, you don't. Then to your left. Let's just... We're already there. Left, left. Oh, that's the wrong one. No, sorry, I've got lost. So let's instead, when it comes back,
forward, right.
instead, there is something called find. What do you want to know about? Now, the other day, when I was playing about with this, just getting familiarity, I typed in a 3-letter word here, about which I'm slightly ashamed, but as the results were rather interesting, I thought I'd share them with you. So we press the action button, and see how it's... Remember, all this ran on a BBC Micro in 1986. And notice it's economically active. Forget the keyword we used to get there. And so, for instance, we can have economically active middle-aged women around about how about old adults? There won't be many of those. We're all of us economically inactive. I've not actually been down this lake before. So. And so now we've got to say whereabouts we're interested in. Now it says type of area. Now the only thing I've ever been able to get it to accept is county. I've tried city, but it says county works. And I've tried Lancashire, and that works. But let's have Kent, because we're nearer to Kent here. And that's the grid reference, so there's where the area actually is on the map. And there it is coming up. Now hang on, what do you do now? You press the action button. Thank you, please, officer. And it took a long time on as well, but I have run all this, and it's still doing things. Look, it's there. You are. Look. It's picking it up. It is coming off flash memory, so it's not coming off a speedy disk. Though flash memory is quite quick to read. So all this is being computed on the fly in emulation. and we could even have a key.
Change the resolution, take it right down to 1
Don't challenge me. I've got my hands firmly on the wood, Peter. I'm amazed we've not had an error yet. Because I have to admit there are things that don't work. And I think perhaps at this stage we should give people a chance to ask questions. But that's the chameleon rescue of Doomsday.
It just reminded me that it must be quite a few years ago in this very room, I came with some colleagues, Christopher Warren and Stephen Heppel, who had a working Doomsday machine. And a month or two before, we'd done a demo of it in the Manchester Museum of Science and Industry, and that worked really well. And that Doomsday machine died that night on that table. And everybody had forgotten that the BBC Master had a battery in it.
Well,
The battery had gone flat.
I was in Reading with Peter for a television programme a couple of months back, and there was similar problems afflicted in then when we used the emulator.
Yeah, yeah. So, questions, I think we've got some time for questions.
Actually, on something slightly different. I've had a great interest in Lays Vision, and I remember a Lays Vision disc that came out almost had a certain similarity to the BBC in that it was taking it was where I think people have been given cameras to go out and shoot. It was the Peterborough show.
It was the Peterborough Show Laservision disc. I can't imagine it had a vast sale, but wasn't a BBC one, was it? It was mostly it had some movie of the show, and then it was as if people had rushed around with an Instamatic or something and gone in every marquee and just shot random shots.
It might have been London University, David Clark. Used quite a lot of experimenting.
Oh, all right.
Was there a geology disc made later after? No, it's just that when we were in Manchester, somebody had worked on that.
Can I ask David, when you say store files, how do you store them if you don't store them?
With the current technology, the whole point about files, Len, is that you can take a file from yesterday's technology and copy it onto today's technology, and it's still the same sequence of bytes.
Yes, I appreciate.
And therefore, and that's why you have to have the continuation of civilization.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but what you're saying is today's technology will always be able to be copied onto tomorrow's technology, as long as you don't leave it too far.
So long as it's an abstract digital form,
Yes.
right? Because the digital copies are exact.
Oh, yes, I
and
appreciate that.
That's the key. That's the key.
I suppose the question there is, what do you actually store the files on? Because we store a lot of videotape, and we're storing it on an archive digitised format. I can't remember which one, but I understand that it's only 2 levels reverse compatible. And yeah, something like that. And so there are issues there.
But there you see, you're now talking. Sorry. You see, when you say it's MPEG-2, you're always going to be able to play MPEG-2 files, and even when we're on MPEG-97, you'll still be able to play MPEG-2 files, because keeping software working is not anything like so difficult as Microsoft tried to make it. I'm serious now. What I mean by that is, if you want to keep PDF stuff, get yourself a copy of XPDF. It's source code, you know. And frankly, source code is tremendously durable. You can take a C program that was written at the same time as this thing, and it will compile and run now. You know, so that we feel is the way your software, you know, you garner software, and there are digital repositories, digital format repositories around now, which are ever so good, there's one called Pronom, which comes out of the National Archives when they invented the name when there was still a public record office. And there's another one, is it Stanford again? I think it is. But anyway, in other words, there's already some global responsibility being taken for keeping records of these formats and even for keeping access to software that will process them. And as I say, open source software to process formats exists, and frankly, if it's something you care enough about, it's not that difficult to write a program that will process the digital format into something else. But beware of making irreversible transformations, because if you do, you've lost something and you're never going to be able to get back to what you started with. But, sorry, I've got on a hobby horse then, apologies.
Was there a line in the project plan that tasked anybody with the long term, the preservation of Domesday?
You catch the question. Andy, but I think the answer is no, not really.
No, I think you have to remember that from a television point of view, we thought that if you put stuff in the library, it just lasted. It was actually interactive material was something that we still haven't got our heads around. And television technology has tended to be extremely long-lasting. I mean, we're only just switching off stuff now that, okay, not in the UK, but say in Western Europe, you could watch on a television set that you bought in 1948. So that technology has been long-lasting, and it probably lulled us into a false sense of security. But the direct answer is no, I don't think there was it.
Not enough, no.
It's quite interesting that we had a flurry of activity a few years ago in what's called red button interactivity on television. It's died down because it's quite expensive, but my own department made some fabulous stuff. Walking with beasts, well, it made walking with beasts and so forth. But you know what we've ended up with is we have no preserved copy of that program in its fully interactive format. The only way they could go back was remaster it as a DVD, and that still lost some of the functionality. And nobody, you know, and that was a very brief window of that level of activity because it, you know, it's rather expensive.
Well, there was a project at King's Warren that took recordings of the transmitted data stream program plus.
That's right. Yeah, they recorded the whole multiplex on the big drive. Well, the same machine.
There's only a quick question. The video that you played at the beginning, is it set to be broadcast? Do you have a date?
No, that video was broadcast in 1986.
Oh.
No, I mean, that was a weird coincidence. I started putting some things together, and I just happened to say to a colleague of mine, oh, can you just type Peter Armstrong's name into what's called Infax, which is our library, because I was quite interested to see what programs Peter had worked on, because he and I were producers pretty much at the same time. And up popped a load of programs that Peter had produced, and a lot more that Peter was in. And we went through it, and there was one which was just called the Domesday Project. And I said to my colleague, oh, Peter, we didn't spot that last week because we could have got it out and brought it. So she went, ticket. Oh, it's already out. So I said, who is it out to? It's a bizarre coincidence. And he said, oh, it's out to Sarah Green. And I said, I know Sarah Green, she's just round the corner. So at 11 o'clock this morning, I nipped round to Sarah Green's office. Tape had literally arrived. We got the tape, and she made the DVD while I went to a meeting. So, I mean, how close did she accidentally get? You know? And I only brought it on the basis that, you know, I thought, well, this is kind of a neat thing to have. And fortunately, my PowerPoint failed to work, which gave us the time to do it. Which I can tell the story.
There's always a missing step in projects, and it's interesting that the BBC Domesday Project was missing the step. Chameleon was also missing the same project step. We've joked about step number 8, which is praise for the non-participants, but at the moment projects are never scoped to include the things that are outside of the project, and because they're not scoped, they don't happen, which is preservation or proper post-marketing or support or whatever it is, but preservation is always lacking from a project because the project is never running while that activity needs to happen. Otherwise, all projects would have to be infinite, and I think we can see a problem with that.
I mean, curiously enough, I learned that lesson from the Domesday project that I was not involved in. And we were doing an online project which became the People's War. You may have been aware of it. It was a really neat idea to collect, which came out of the idea that during the Second World War, a lot of the records about the First World War got lost because they were bombed and so forth. And so I said to a colleague of mine, Chris Warren, well, the only way we can get this is we've got to ask folks who are still alive. And out of that came this People's War project, where we collected memories. And the young woman who was the producer on it, I said to her, there'll come a point, because it's in the nature of organisations like the BBC, when we'll get bored of this. And yet, in some ways, it's very, very precious. We've collected a lot of really rather important memories. So at the beginning of your project, figure out who you are going to give it to at the end. And I said, there are very, very few organisations that I would put an honest fiver on being around in 100 years' time, CO2 not being withstanding. And they are going to be the British Library, the National Archives, probably the British Museum. You know,
BBC might be.
well, I'm cautious. Yeah, you know, there are, but I mean, you get an organisation like the, National Archives. I mean, it's legislated to exist. That's the point. The BBC is not legislated to exist forevermore. So I agree with you, but it is very tricky sometimes to find out who is the most appropriate person to give this material to.
In a way, there's a push and pull, because I think if you looked at it from a Prince 2 kind of
if you looked at it from a Prince 2 kind of stakeholders point of view, if there were known to be organisations or even people within the BBC who had a requirement to have the archives and projects in that way, then they would be the stakeholder and the project that should be pulled towards it. Now, in a sense, for linear programs, the tape library fulfills that. You write the number on the tape, or whatever happens now, and it goes into there, and you kind of imagine that in 20 years' time, you'll be able to go back and play it back again. And Written Archives has been doing a wonderful job of keeping everything from Lord Reith's post-it notes onwards. He invented the post-it note. But interactivity has been difficult, partly because of just the issue of how do you keep that whole package? It's not as neatly packageable. But I'm wondering, prompted by what you said, as to whether there needs to be the library equivalent of something for interactive and for read book and websites and so on. Because I know that even organisations like the National Archive are relying on archive.org, the Wayback When machine, to archive government websites. And that's because they're there and they operate as that kind of stakeholder pull.
I mean, you touched on a real nerve there, because the Wayback Machine goes back to '96, I think. Certainly the BBC has got 2 years' worth of websites before that. How do I know this? Because I wrote most of the HTML for them, so that's why I know it. I was a kind of active producer, still remain the case. And for quite a few years, when it used to be very simple brochureware web pages, I carried the backup copy of the website around on 2 floppy disks in my pocket. Now, I can't now find those floppy disks. And I ended up on a committee, a digital archiving committee at the BBC some years ago. And we all turned up, the archive people came and understand everything. And I thought, I'm going to stir this a bit. So I said, has anybody got a copy of the very first BBC webpage? And we went, well, because nobody has. That's the kind of weird thing. And all of a sudden, kind of shock came in. And, the BBC, built into the sort of charter, is that the BBC will, every 10 years, effectively record its own history. And the employer, professional historian, was Asa Briggs for some years and would write the next 10 years. I can guarantee there is going to be a gap in that history of the BBC in terms of its digital activity and its interactive activity from around about 94 for quite a few years, because we have nothing. I don't know where the files are.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a bit like the way that early television had to go out live because it couldn't be recorded, and so that's lost. But can I just reiterate the digital aspect, where the fact of perfect digital copies does allow the lots of copies approach as well. Of course, the question of copyright raises its ugly head, but don't forget the original intention of copyright was to stop stuff getting lost, not to keep Walt Disney rich.
Hey, wow.
Hi, I want to recall January 1987. There's a thing called the BET Show that some of you may know, some of you may not. But the BET Show, British Education, Technology and Training, or something of that kind, ran, of course, in January 1987 with the Domesday Disc as its biggest new thing, you know, and I can almost sing the theme tune from the disc because it was playing all around the hall constantly as people booted it up and played it. But the reason I'm saying all this is partly to indulge myself in that memory and partly to say to you, to Peter really and to the team, what of the educative purpose do you recall and think about beyond the simple thing of, I don't mean to be just unkind when I say simple, that's a very powerful thing, the then and now. But there's much more, isn't there? There's so much more. And I have the belief that the BBC, both in the literacy project before and in the Domesday Project, had this educative purpose. And I think it shouldn't be forgotten. It has great value, and there were teachers who were able to use the system in the end. There were many, many documents written to say this is how we might construct a lesson around the disc to make it valuable to children.
Okay. Any more questions? Andy?
The rain.
That was Andy talking about the Scottish wilderness.
That's the rainy Scottish wilderness. Picking up on your comment about education, one of those things that changed between the original idea and the production of the project was the introduction of the national curriculum. What we had thought initially was that, and plenty of us had mothers and sisters who were teachers in both primary and secondary, is that the notion of getting the kids to do things around the local community was something that schools at that time really liked to do. And so we felt that it was going to be a no-brainer really for schools to pick up in terms of helping while the project was being made and then making use of the material afterwards. But unfortunately, the introduction of the national curriculum seemed to leave out local studies. And the main result of this was that the majority of children who took part in the surveys were in primary because they weren't tied to the curriculum. All the secondary kids, no matter how much they might have liked to have done it, it seemed as if the teachers weren't able to find that slot in the day because of how things became regimented. So those are some of those outside, you're doing your project plan, you have these outside clouds. And I think we kind of got on the wrong side of quite a few of those outside
Professor
clouds.
Ted Ragg he produced the teacher's guide of what to do with some of that, how to use it within the classroom, and some of the project ideas.
You've got a copy of that, George.
Documentation from Ted Ragg.
That's fantastic.
Teacher's handbook.
True to say he was one of the great champions of the whole thing. It was only because he believed in it in the early meetings and took it back to the LEAs and to influential people in education and to the ministry that actually people bought into it. I think without his support,
But it fitted beautifully into the current, certainly the current primary educational model of the time. And you're right, the national curriculum did put a full stop on that kind of exploratory, overarching educational concept. It became much more targeted to the specifics that we know today.
It is amazing when I speak about this to audiences, how many people there say, oh yes, I did that when I was in school. And they remember the experience of going out and finding out things a mile away from their school that they never knew was there, and meeting people and so on. So I think actually the doing of it, the collecting of the data in many ways was the most powerful thing, more so than reading it back afterwards.
Well, as a teacher that was involved in that, I quite agree, yeah, absolutely. It was a phenomenal experience.
I discovered again.
Why not do it now is the question.
Well, yes.
I discovered yet again the only way to shut up BBC people is to steal the microphone. But it is 10 to 5, and the attention span of members of the CCS tends to go plummet down at this stage. So I think we ought to say thank you for all that. Thank you very much. It's been fascinating. Lots of things that we didn't really know were going on, and we now know what was going on, and that's what the history of things was all about. So thank you to George, to Peter, to Andy, to David. And I'm heartened by one thing. The CCS, when it all goes belly up, the CO2 is all around us, and that's it. The CCS is halfway there. Because we are the Civilization Conservation Society. this year. This is the end of our season. We reopen again in September. Watch the website for further details. Thank you very much.